What's amazing about the mainstream media and the general audience that they assume is this lack of awareness they think we all have. And I'll tell you what I mean. All day, every day, we're hearing about how bad Putin is, and he is. He's a brutal dictator, they tell us, and he is. He went into Ukraine, and before he invaded, and now during the invasion, the US is serving up some harsh words and threats for him, but only from the podium, because on the sidelines, Putin and Russia have a VIP seat at the negotiating table with Iran, where the US is completely focused on getting that deal. They make you think they're punishing Putin with sanctions and more threats, but Putin is getting incentives he never dreamed of getting, including a potential $10 billion deal, and first offer to buy Iran's excess enriched uranium, all in exchange for being the middleman, the main arbiter between the US and Iran in getting that deal. So, what's in that deal? That's what we all want to know. Why is it so great that the US is willing to deal with an awful dictator in order to score a deal with a more awful dictator? And why the secrecy? If it's so good, share it with all of us. Why aren't you being transparent about it? Why can't the public know? Or better yet, members of Senate and Congress, why can't they get the details? Well, thanks to my guest, we have some details, but that's only because he was brave enough to leak them on a thread on his Twitter page, giving us just some of the horrific concessions that our administration is making to get this through. I want to welcome back our guest, and first welcome you back to the Foreign Desk Podcast. I'm Lisa Daftari, and my guest today, Gabriel Noronha, former special advisor on Iran to the State Department under President Trump, currently executive director for two foreign policy initiatives in DC. And welcome back, Gabriel.
Hey, thanks for having me, Lisa. Appreciate it.
Of course. Gabriel, I want to get right into this. You posted a series of tweets, a thread of about 18 or 19 tweets earlier this month to your Twitter page that got a tremendous amount of attention, of course, because you're the first to leak many of these very sensitive details. Of course, I say sensitive because no one else in the administration wants to tell us what they are. Tell us just a bit about the background. How did you get this information and why did you leak it?
Sure. So I think as background, it's important to know that over the last few months, three of Biden's top nuclear negotiators in Vienna have resigned from the team, and that included two political appointees. So these aren't sort of conservatives. These aren't, aggrieved people. These are people that were, pretty deep in the establishment for the Biden administration who said, this is going off the rails. This is just bad. And they resigned because they didn't want to be a part of it. In addition to that, there were several career members of the government who had such serious reservations that they asked me to basically expose some of the things going on, partly because the Russians know what's in it, the Chinese know what's in it, the Iranians know what's in it, but Congress doesn't. And so there's a really
sorry, I'm going to cut you. I'm so sorry to cut you off because right there, it's like, regardless of your political affiliation, aren't you just jolting, coming out of your skin to say the Chinese know, the Russians know, and I think most Americans would agree that they're pretty much our enemies, and they know, but we don't know.
Yeah, that's exactly. It's just preposterous. It doesn't make any sense. I even found out in the last couple of days that looking through some of my old records and the information given to me by U.S. government sources, that the Iranians actually even reported to their own parliament almost all the same details that I was able to report out publicly. They did that last year, and it was hidden in obscure reports. And so they're briefing their own members of parliament about what's going on. So again, it leads to the very strange question, why aren't they doing it? And I think it's simply because if the American public fully understood what was happening in this deal, they would demand that the negotiations end. They would recall our negotiators entirely, and this whole charade would end.
Yeah, well, we have had some demands, and we'll get to that, both bipartisan on both sides. We've had lawmakers, but before we do that, I want to get into some of the meat that you tweeted. Can you give us some of the juiciest nuggets of all of this?
Sure. So some of the, looking back a little bit, if you go back to 2015, that deal claimed that the United States would be able to impose sanctions on terrorists and human rights offenders without breaching the deal. Now, when President Trump came back and reimposed sanctions, he also, in addition, imposed terrorism sanctions, human rights sanctions, and sanctions against some of the worst offenders in the regime. Now, this administration is planning to drop almost all of those sanctions, and that includes them on some of the regime's worst terrorists. Folks like Mohsen Rezai and Ali Akbar Veliati, who together masterminded an attack in Argentina that killed over 85 Jews and Argentinians. Folks like IRGC General Degani, who was behind the Beirut barracks bombing that killed 240 Americans and 58 French
Right.
soldiers. And then the regime's top leaders who are involved in executing over 5,000 political prisoners. Sanctions on Khamenei himself, even though he ordered the killing of over 1,500 Iranians in protests in November 2019. Those are some of the regime's most brutal and evil men who have countless lives on their hands, including hundreds of American lives. They'll be able to have their assets unfrozen. In theory, they could come to the United States because they're not sanctioned anymore. But what's also really troubling is not just the individuals they're reducing sanctions on, but the terror networks and organizations which are used institutionally to kill Americans and spread terror around the region, killing and targeting Israelis, Arabs alike. So the Central Bank of Iran is one of the IRGC's top terror funders. The National Iranian Oil Company just fuels money to the IRGC as well. Those are getting removed from sanctions. And then the worst thing is that, and we've had this reported by Axios and others as well since I first reported it, is that the administration is proposing lifting sanctions on the IRGC itself as a foreign terrorist organization. Now, what that would do is it would allow current and former members of the IRGC to come in and stay in the United States at the same time that the IRGC is plotting to assassinate my former boss, Brian Hook, Secretary Pompeo, John Bolton at the NSC, and Biden's current top generals, according to public reports, General Milley and General McKenzie are also under Iranian assassination threat. But they're basically saying not only will we drop sanctions against that organization, members of it could come into the United States. And then that's not to mention the roughly $90 billion that this deal would provide to Iran once you reduce all these sanctions.
My God. My God. I mean, there's something for everyone in this, right? To be appalled, that is, right? So if it's not the American blood on their hands, if it's not the terror money that's going to be freed up to bring about, more terror sprees in the Middle East on American assets and our allies, if it's not, their human rights abuses against LGBTQ plus, if it's not their, targeting of women and children and journalists and dancers and poets and political oppositions, there's really something for everyone in there to, again, oppose and say, what the heck are we doing? Why do they, I mean, where is the outrage, I should say, first of all, from these human rights groups? Why don't we hear about these details when people like you are brave enough to bring them to light? Why? Just why?
It's really disappointing to me that, look, I'm very happy to verify with any journalist who's interested the details of everything I've laid out.
Right.
Many of them, again, as you spoke about, targeted and are persecuting LGBT people and executed between 4,000 and 6,000 of them in Iran.
My God.
It's unfortunate to me that journalists aren't working overtime to try to expose the details. Some of it is technical, but look, I think it's doing the American public a great disservice. And I think what so many people are so concerned about inside the U.S. government is they've seen what happened in Afghanistan. They saw what happened now with Russia and Ukraine, and they're sort of saying, okay, this is a third disaster coming down the line. It's preventable, but people need to pay attention, need to sort of say, hey, we need to stop this. And I think in many ways this could be worse because it results down the road in Iran getting a nuclear weapon and having tens of billions of dollars to sort of supercharge violence in the region. That's one of the reasons it's very dangerous. I wish more reporters would cover it. There are a few who do. I'm glad that you cover it and some of our other friends do. But you're right. This is something that every American should be concerned about. Fortunately, there's a lot of members of Congress, including Democrats, who are writing
Mhm.
to Biden, and
Right,
saying this is ridiculous. What is going
right.
on here?
Right, and that exactly segueing into my next question, which is there is bipartisan, there's a coalition, really, both in Congress and in Senate that have come together to write letters and to petition and just demand transparency, if nothing more, because they know this is going to a bad place. Like you said, we had these resignations from people inside. So if they have a row seat at the table and they're the ones who are resigning. And as you said, they are part of this administration. They are not right wing hawks that are by any means trying to bring their own agenda to this, and they're opposing this. So when there is bipartisan opposition, when there are people like yourself who are, highlighting this, and just a handful of reporters I know, but when you say, it's technical, what do you mean by that? Is it by design, or are they being blissfully ignorant, or do they just not understand or have access to these details?
Look, it's all public. If there's a report I helped translate, which lists all the executive orders and all the various regulations that are being lifted. Now, some of those are daunting to those who don't, follow and pay attention to every sanctions bulletin like I do. But really, it's not too much to demand that the New York Times or the Washington Post do a little digging, see what's out there publicly available, and report on it. I think they should do it. And like as you said, some members of Congress are doing that. Robert
Mm.
Menendez, for example, in the Senate, the chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, gave an hour-long speech on the floor of the Senate
Mhm.
saying this doesn't make sense. You have Democrats like Josh Gottheimer, who went on TV and
Right.
saying this shouldn't happen. Elaine Luria and others as well.
Mhm.
I really hope that Democrats across the board listen to their own colleagues, because these are some of the ones who have paid attention to Iran for the longest. They're deep in this issue, and they
Right.
really understand this is troubling. What I'm afraid of is that you're going to have too many Democrats who are going to sort of want to be deferential to the administration and will just say, I'm not going to dig too deep. You guys are in charge. We'll let you do what you want to do. That to
Right.
me would be Congress really abrogating its duty to the American people. Their job is not to be just a check mark on the administration because they're parties in power. That's not what it's supposed to
Right.
be. They're supposed to be independent thinkers who look and can judge and say, this is what's best for our nation.
A question I often get, and you'd be the best person to answer that because you have worked on the inside, is, how many different ways could this go? Like choose your own adventure kind of thing. What could be the different ways in which the administration handles this? Because we know what their end goal is. We know that they're, really trying to zoom to a deal, and obviously they want to avoid any obstacles to that, or any opposition to that. So, what are the different ways that they could get this deal through? And going from really the most open to the most closed in the sense of transparency, what are the different ways that they could carry this out?
Sure. So what on the most open end, and this is what we pledged to do when I was working at the State Department, was you could negotiate this as a treaty, and you can submit it to the Senate, where if
Mhm.
2/3 of the Senate approves it, it is legally binding under U.S. law, and the American public has a real chance through that process to see what's happening. Second would be, and this is probably more more likely, is you frame it as we are reaching a new deal with Iran, and we are going to submit it pursuant to this law called NARA. NARA was passed in 2015 because Congress was afraid of what was going to happen with the JCPOA, and they
Mhm.
basically said any deal that gets negotiated around Iran's nuclear deal has to be submitted to Congress. And that gives Congress 35 days effectively to review the deal and either give an up or down vote. That's what this administration should do. They should
Mhm.
submit any deal they reach there, and then they can make their case in Congress.
Mhm.
But what I've been told from folks at the State Department and elsewhere is that the administration doesn't want to follow the law, and they're looking for every way to avoid it. And so the argument they're going to make is that they are merely returning to the original JCPOA, which they say
Wow.
already got a vote, and therefore doesn't need to be voted on again. Now,
So,
this is, oh, go ahead.
yeah. Yeah, no. So I just want to underscore what you're saying, because you're speaking and you're brilliant, and the way that you say this is so eloquent, but you're really just brushing over the most egregious of facts here to say your sources who are inside the Biden administration are telling you that the Biden administration wants to do this in an illegal way.
Yes, that's
It's
you
crazy.
got it right. They're trying to figure out how to break the law and how to get away with breaking the law. What I'm most afraid of is
My
that they
God.
simply won't submit the deal at all to Congress. I don't know what
And that's
justification
the third
is,
option.
and that's the third option is they simply
Mhm.
say we're not going to say. And the problem is if that's what Congress does, there's not a whole the administration does. There's not a whole lot that Congress can do except for sue, which is exactly what they should do. They should sue the Biden administration and say you've broke the law. But they're not afraid to break the
My
law.
God.
That's what I've been told by everyone.
Right, and if they sue, I imagine that it would be too little, too late. It would just be a slap on the wrist at that point.
Because Iran will have gotten $90 billion as soon as the deal's done. They'll have that
Wow.
$90 billion, and then it doesn't really matter what Congress does. They'll
Mhm.
already have gotten the money and they can walk away.
Right. Today, speaking of adding, insult to injury, they announced sanctions on Iran's ballistic missiles, which critics, as you well know, have long been saying it's not part of the deal. It's so ludicrous to not, to be at the negotiating table with someone you're calling a partner in a deal, yet on the sidelines have to take this punitive action against their missiles program, which will deliver a weapon and think that this is a trustworthy partner.
So what happens under this deal is 18 months from now, next October, all restrictions on Iran's missile program lift. So Iran can buy the most advanced missiles from Russia, from China, which could target Paris, they could target London, and yes, they could probably even target the U.S. mainland if Russia and China give the most advanced weapons to them. So this new
Right.
sanction today is just a small slap on the wrist. It's mostly for messaging purposes. It doesn't
Yes.
really have, if you want to do something, you should actually enforce the sanctions we have on the books about
Right.
Iran's
Right.
oil trade. That's what
Or
matters. These sanctions
yes.
on ballistic missile suppliers don't really hurt
No,
Iran.
it's perhaps, like you said, symbolic to kind of shut the critics up who are saying, "Wait a minute, what about the ballistic missiles that you did not address in this deal?" And speaking of the deal, you brought up 2015, which we've talked about a lot, and we talk about how that was already a bad deal. This one is much worse for many reasons, and if you could outline just a few as to how they're different and why this deal is even worse than the one we had under President Obama.
So in 2015, the restrictions on Iran's nuclear program basically all ended in 2031. So that gave you 15 years to try to get a new deal, try to negotiate something else. Here, they're just expiring 9 years from now in 2015, in 2031. So you have even less time. The arms embargo on Iran will have already expired. So now Iran can buy regular weapons from Russia, China, sell them to the Houthis, sell them to Hezbollah, Hamas, with no restrictions. And then there's these talk of what are called inherent guarantees in this deal, which, from what I've been hearing, would allow Iran to either keep all of its uranium in country, keep its top advanced centrifuges in country, and just put them under lock and key. So that if the United States withdraws, they can go back up to being able to have nuclear weapons enrichment in a week, 2 weeks,
My
no
goodness.
problem. So this is a far weaker standard, far weaker deal than the last deal. And Iran gets hundreds and hundreds of sanctions lifted that weren't even in existence in 2015 for that deal.
Right. Well, because maybe they weren't even necessary. We also had a more lenient, or at least on the face of it, a more lenient president. Now you have the butcher in charge who's actually open about his, horrific, human rights record and his stance. And they're not even trying to give off the appearance of being a more willing partner. The question I have is, and maybe you've had this conversation with your sources. What do they believe? I mean, truly being there and picking up on all of the cues and picking up on all of the feelings at the table. Why are they doing this? I mean, what is it truly this feeling that this deal will get a better outcome, or is it just purely letting them off the hook and just following this track record of appeasement through foreign policy appeasement? Why are they doing this? Do your sources have any intel on that?
So I'll be slightly generous for a second. I think there's one reason, which is they think that they want the Iranian nuclear problem to go away for a little bit. They say, hey, we've got enough with China on our plate, with Russia on our plate. We don't want to have to deal with Iran right now. So we're just going to kick the can down the road and let someone else deal with it. Um, that is misguided in my view, because the problem will just be worse 9 years from now. But it is a view. I think it's wrong, but it's a view. I think the more worrying view is the one that you were outlining, which is they don't like the world where we are allied with Israel and partnering with the Arab states against Iran. They think that they want to partner with Iran and use Iran to balance out Israel, to balance out Saudi Arabia, who the Biden officials call a murderous thug. Saudi Arabia is not perfect, to be clear. Um, and they want to create a new Middle East, a new strategic realignment that doesn't have Israel at the center of it, that has everyone as an equal, as a partner. I think this is incredibly dangerous when you have a regime whose really core reason is to destroy Israel, destroy the United States, displant them,
Mhm.
and create an Islamic caliphate. I don't think you can trust someone like that. I think Rob Malley and Blinken are extremely misguided with this ideology.
Yes, and I appreciate you trying to be generous there because it just shows your character, but I don't buy it. I just don't buy that first, because there are just way too many inconvenient truths. I mean, if Iran was actually even putting on a better show for us and not requiring this public, first of all, I think if it were true that they wanted to be as kind as you're giving them credit for, this deal would have been done a long time ago, because we know that US officials would have given or done anything they can. So I know that the Iranian regime is making it more and more difficult for them by just being themselves, right? So I think your second reasoning, or the what you outlined, is actually spot on in terms of the mentality and this desire to have a new vision, a new world vision, a reset, as President Biden actually said in his remarks about Russia Ukraine. So I do believe he thinks that there will be a new world order, and this is part of that vision. We're kind of going to start wrapping up here, but lawmakers that you said, Democrat lawmakers who have opposed this, and Bob Menendez, who you brought up, said something very, very interesting and very true that we've heard before. But in his words, he said, our goal must be to get the right deal, not just any deal. And to that end, is there a good deal that is to be had here? Is there something we can do, and what would that look like?
Look, when I first started working on Iran, I believed there was a good deal to be had, and it would look something like what Secretary Pompeo called for, that really required a fundamental shift in their foreign policy. Look, I'll be honest. I do not believe that while Supreme Leader Khamenei is alive, you will get a good deal with Iran, because I think what he wants is so diametrically opposed to what is in the United States' national interest that there's no deal to be had that makes sense. That's okay. A deal for the sake of a deal doesn't make sense. If you can get a good deal, I'm all for it. But the
Mhm.
Iranian regime has become, all they want is a way in the long term to destroy the West. And while that is their foreign policy and that's their outlook, there's no reason to make a deal with that. You can't make a deal with ISIS. No one would say, hey, we should reach an accommodation with ISIS. You say, okay, we have to figure out every way to thwart their
Mhm.
plans. Um, but look, if you put maximum pressure on Iran again, if you collapse their economy and you said, look, you have two options, the destruction of your regime or you make a deal, then the regime would be forced to make a deal. The
Mhm.
issue is we haven't seen anything like that from this administration. We've seen them give billions and billions of dollars in sanctions relief, non-enforced sanctions, that there's no incentive for the Iranians to make any concessions.
Any
They're sort of
concessions?
floating by rather comfortably right now. And so, no, under this administration, there will not be a deal that I think is worth. Congress accepting or the American people saying this would be a good deal. I just don't think it's possible at this point.
Yeah, and I would be remiss not to mention the 80 million people in Iran who are telling us, who have been informing us for 40 years about what this regime is and what they endure day in and day out, and a majority of whom, do not want this government and do not want this way of life. And yet, here we have the United States, beacon of hope and freedom and justice and liberty, that is trying to liberate and try to legitimize their government with money and with geopolitics that just does not fit the crime. And I want to end on the last line of your thread, which I thought was so profound, because we do throw around the concept of sanctions all the time, and they can be pointless, like today's sanctions on Iran's missile program, or they can be extremely, extremely helpful, as we saw under the pressure campaign under President Trump on Iran. And your last line of the thread was, these sanctions are not merely economic tools; they speak truth to the face of evil, which is absolutely true. And I thank you for your courage and for really, you're out of office in the sense of working for the country and for the State Department, but you did your duty as somebody who cares about, global stability and Iran and the Iranian people and our foreign policy, and really Iranian U.S. assets and the blood of Americans and those who have served this country on the hands of the Iranian regime and all of their tentacles in the region. So I thank you very much for the work that you're continuing to do. I encourage you all to follow him on social media and to follow his work. And hopefully we'll have you back here periodically to give us updates. For the rest of you who'd like to follow us here at the Foreign Desk, you can subscribe to our podcast on youtube.com/Lisa Daftari and sign up for our daily top 10 email to stay on top of all the global headlines every weekday morning. Go to foreigndesknews.com and you can subscribe there. See you all next week.